If you want to change the world, you've got to learn to carry the cheese. And so I know that sounds kind of strange at first, but the title of our message this morning is simply this: carry the cheese. Carry the cheese. And we're going to look at 3 ways that we can be ready to change the world. I'm going to go ahead and give you point 1. If you're a note taker, I'm going to go ahead and give you point 1. It's this, is that we have to learn to serve before we try to lead. We've got to learn to serve before we try to lead. So if you got your Bible open to 1 Samuel 17, we're going to look at verses 16 through 19, and then we'll talk about this for a few minutes. So in verse 16, it says this: "The Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. Then Jesse said to David, his son, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. For Saul and they and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines.'" So learn to serve before you try to lead. As we look at these opening few verses, we see here that Jesse, David's father, is giving him a task to accomplish. He's giving him a chore that really could have been carried out by anybody in his household. Any family member, any servant that was under his care, literally anyone could have done the thing that Jesse was asking David to do. But Jesse asks his son, as a matter of fact, his youngest son, the shepherd boy, the one who was still there at the house taking care of the sheep while his brothers were out fighting in this great war. Fighting is a kind of an overstatement. They're there at this great war. And I want us to know, and I want us to not miss, that literally one chapter before, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we see this picture painted for us where God sends Samuel to Jesse's house. And brother after brother after brother walks through the house. And everyone that walks through, Samuel says, "Man, God, that one looks pretty good. Like, that dude's pretty tall. Like, that guy's pretty buff. Like, shouldn't he be the next king of Israel? Like, you see that guy's beard? Like, he just looks like a king." And brother after brother, God said no. And then finally, David would walk in, and God saw David's heart, and he said, "This is the person that's going to be the next king of Israel." So from there, Samuel would very literally take oil and pour it onto David's head, signifying and setting him apart that he is to be the next crowned king of the nation of Israel. So when we read that and when we understand that this is the person that Jesse's asking to carry some bread and some cheese to his brothers at war. So he's not just asking anyone to carry out this task, he's asking the future king to carry the food to his older brothers and to his commanders. I love that when we see in this text, there's no pushback from David. He doesn't get mad at his dad. He doesn't scoff at his dad. He doesn't say, "Are you kidding me? Do you know who I am? I'm the anointed next king of Israel. You want me to carry some cheese to my brothers?" He doesn't make excuses. I'm sure this never happens in your house, but I have 2 older children who anytime I ask them to do anything, they've got a list full of excuses of reasons of why they cannot carry out the task that I've given them. They're too tired. It'll take too long. It's too big of a mess. My response is always, "Well, I'm not the one that made the mess. Who did, right? Somebody did. It wasn't me." He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't do those things. And so I think what we see here is that we see David proactively living out that we should never despise small beginnings. Meaning, I think that David understood that everybody has to start somewhere. And if his task is to learn to serve his brothers and to take them this food to war, then he was willing to do that. Even Jesus himself says in Luke chapter 16, verse 10, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much." I'm going to ask you a question. Don't raise your hand. It might be embarrassing, even though most of us are going to be in the same boat. But have you ever been asked to do something before, and before you could really process all of it, before you could really think about the response that you were going to give, you were already automatically thinking, "Man, that task is beneath me. I shouldn't have to do that. I got people that can do that. There's other people who could carry out that thing." That has to be the spot that David is in. And so I think that we have to be so careful that as we grow and that as we mature, that we don't allow pride to creep into our heart, because when pride creeps in, then things become beneath us, and it's not worth our time. It's not worth us doing. I love that we see, as I already mentioned, that David doesn't push back. He doesn't talk back. He doesn't refuse to carry the cheese. He just says, yes, sir, and he does the task that his father gave him to accomplish. Literally the anointed next king of Israel, willing to take food to his brothers, living out a quote that I've told you before, but I love it too much not to say it again, that if you are too big to serve, then you are too small to lead. David's living this out in real time as we're reading through the text. What's happening in David's life is something that we call character development, meaning that God is putting him in positions and in situations where he can learn to serve. When I first felt called to go into ministry, one of the very first things that every pastor in my life told me that I needed to do is they're like, you need to do an internship. Not so that they could get free work out of me, although that was part of it, but so that I could learn what it meant to serve God and serve his church and serve his people. You know, when you think about David here, he's the anointed next king of Israel, but I think God wanted David to understand that you have to learn to serve your people before you can be king over your people. And he started in the humblest ways possible by serving his brothers and the commander of their armies. Think about this. I grew up an only child, which probably explains a little bit of what's wrong with me, right? But God saw fit in his humor to give me 3 children because they say statistically that 3 is the hardest number to raise and that you like chaos if you only have 3 children. Everybody tells us to have 4. I say 3 is enough for me, right? But as we raise 3 children, there's not one of my children that likes to share their food with another one. And there's not one that wants to go get food for the others, not because they're just inherently selfish and terrible children. They just don't want to serve food to their siblings. And this is what we see David ultimately doing. David is being formed and shaped in this moment in 1 Samuel chapter 17. He's literally learning to serve, whether he realizes it or not. About a month ago, I had the honor to go to this thing called Youth Pastor Summit, and I was able to take some of our next-gen staff with us, and I was able to take some of our adult leader volunteers that serve in our student ministry in some different areas. And we went, and we got to hear this guy share from the stage, and I've heard him share a couple times. I think he's awesome, and I think he's doing some great things. But he shared this quote that really is kind of opened my heart and opened my eyes to some things that we're doing, and he simply just said this: in our Christian culture today, we've allowed skill and talent to land people on stages and in leadership before their walk with Christ, their character, and their integrity are developed enough for them to be there in the first place. When you think about that, I'm not saying that we don't give people chances. I'm not saying that we don't kind of push people out and let them lead, but we've got to make sure that they've learned to serve before they try to lead. I'm just simply saying that if we get out and if we desire the spotlight and the things, then that we've got it out of order, and we're called to serve God and serve his people before we ever try to lead. And so we see this literally being modeled by David. And just like David, I think all of us, every single one of us, myself included, have room for growth. That we have room to improve. That we have room to seek after our Heavenly Father and to learn to serve his people better. You know, we see David here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, but what about our ultimate example, Jesus, right? He said this in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, a verse that's familiar with many of you. He says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus, our Savior, literally leading the way by serving all of humanity. This is the model that we're striving after. You know, I mentioned as we started this morning that today is the start of our 6th year at First Baptist Church of Umatilla. But what's cool about this week and the way God's lined things up in our life is that on Thursday, that was the start of our 14th year in full-time student ministry, which explains the other half of what's wrong with me, right? We've been working with teenagers for 13 years, and we love it, and I think it's what's kept me young, even though gray hair is creeping in on me very, very fast. But we've been serving in full-time student ministry for 13 years now and just started our 14th. And I say that to just let you know that over those 14 years, our experience in our service has been kind of composed of 4 different churches. We were at our first church over in Tavares, not far from here. We were there for about 2 years, and then we went to a church in Orangeburg, South Carolina for 4 years. And then we were at a church in Inverness, Florida for right at about 2 years until you guys called me and stole me over here to First Baptist Church of Umatilla. And then we've been here for 5 years now, which has been amazing. But I say that to say this, that in each church, in each context, in each role, in each responsibility, there were lessons to be learned, and there were ways for me and for my wife and for my family to grow as a follower of Christ, but also as a pastor to take God's word and to reach the next generation. That there are ways that I learned to serve God and to serve his people. And the great thing is even after 5 years here, I'm not there yet. I still have things to learn. I still have space to grow. Believe it or not, I know you're going to find this so hard to believe. I still get it wrong sometimes. I still miss the mark. I still have to call and apologize. I still have to do some of those things because why? There's room to grow. You should never stop learning to serve. That the call of God in your life is so important that you would never stop doing the things that he's called you to do. And so in all of those different churches and all of those contexts, I've learned these different ways to serve and different ways to be faithful to God and to his church. And the thing that I want us to understand from this is talking about me, but it's projected to all of us that it's the same in our life. That as I've gone through these years of following Jesus in this call to ministry, as I've stayed faithful to him, as I've trusted him when it was easier not to, when I've decided to continue to serve him, that he's stayed faithful to me. That he's blessed my family, that he continues to allow me in spite of me to serve him and to serve his church for his kingdom and for his name's sake. And so I say that to help us to understand that if we will all do that in our lives, that if we'll serve him, that we'll lean into him, that if we'll trust in him, that the same exact thing will be true for us. And I know that you'll be the same as me, that we'll be beyond grateful for all that the Lord has done. This is what we're learning here from David in 1 Samuel chapter 17. I don't know about you, but I want to make sure that I get but keep a serving spirit. That it's never about me. That it's always about God and about his people and about his church moving forward. So number one, we see that we got to learn to serve before we try to lead. Number two, we've got to allow your past to prepare your future. Allow your past to prepare your future. Look at verses 31 through 37 with me. We skipped just a little bit of context here, but basically what happens is David is there, he's delivered the food, he rolls up, and this guy named Goliath, who's a giant, is talking trash about God, and he's running his mouth, and David simply asks the question, hey, what's the reward for the person that shuts this guy up, is essentially what he says, and his brothers are mad at him because they're like, why are you here? Why are you asking about the reward? You only want this for your name and for your fame, for your accolades, and then this is where we pick up in verse 37. David says this, when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and will fight this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. When we think about this, allowing your past to prepare you for your future, there is so much to unpack here in verses 31 through 37, but the first thing that we see is that David in this moment is still a youth. He's essentially a teenager. We see that King Saul, he says that you're nothing more than a youth, while this guy Goliath, this Philistine, this giant, has been a warrior since his youth. Meaning this, there's an age gap there. There's a difference in age and in experience and in skill set. And Saul's warning David, listen, I don't know if you know what you're getting into. Keep it in mind that, again, David is really only even here because he was essentially being Uber Eats for his brothers, and that's the only reason he's there in the valley of Elah. But as he's there, he hears this Philistine talking about his God. And we see in these verses that David starts downloading his resume to Saul. And he says, no, listen, you don't understand. Like, I've been a shepherd over my father's sheep. And there's been two different occasions, one where a lion and one where a bear came and they took a sheep. And I didn't just say, you know what, man, like, it's just one sheep. Like, how mad could my dad possibly be? I didn't just say, oh, you know what, like, it's a lot of effort. You ever fought a bear before? You ever fought, like, that doesn't sound enjoyable. Like, let's just keep chilling with the rest of the sheep. No. It says that as they took the sheep, that David is the one that pursued the sheep. It wasn't like David was just in fight or flight mode and the thing came at him and he had to kill him just to protect his own life. It says in the text that he pursued the lion, that he pursued the bear, that he went after them, that as they took one of his sheep, he went after them, attacked them, he was on the offense, got his sheep back, and then when they rose up, he grabbed him by the beard and killed him. Which lets me know that David was a dude, like he knew what he was doing. Like this is hand-to-hand close combat. I'm not trying to go to the zoo and fight a lion. Like it's just not gonna happen. David knew what he was doing. And so he's saying this to Saul, but ultimately what David is saying here is that David had an unwavering faith in his God and that his God had delivered him before, so he knew that his God would deliver him again. And so when we've been in that spot where maybe we've had some things that have happened in our past, and God's come through for us. Like God's shown us that he is who he says he is, that he will do what he says that he'll do. Then we should have the confidence in our present and even in our future that when something comes up, that if he's done it before, he'll do it again. But so often what happens for us Christians is we're like, man, like I know, gosh, man, like I know that God came through in like 2016 and that was great. And like I prayed for that and it was so amazing that he did it. But like this is 2023, like can he still do it? Yes, he can still do it. This is what David is saying. The God who delivered me from the lion and bear will deliver me from the hands of this Philistine. This is what he says in verse 37. He says, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, go and may the Lord be with you. Again, David's telling Saul, he's saying, listen, I know that I'm not like a veteran. Like, I don't have battles under my belt. Like, I haven't been beside you in war before. Like, I don't have accolades. I don't have awards. I don't have all these things. But I'm prepared for this moment. Like David is telling Saul, I have a past. I have a resume. I have some experience. I've seen some stuff that maybe you yourself haven't even seen, Saul. Well, like I've learned some lessons firsthand that have prepared me to go to battle against this Philistine. I am prepared. This is what David is telling to Saul, that he's prepared. Spiritually speaking, how has your past prepared you for your future? How has your past prepared you for right now? How has the things that you have gone through and walked through, good and bad, prepared you for the current moment in life that you are in right now? Has your past brought you closer to Jesus? Or has your past kept you at arm's length from Jesus because of some hurt and some pain and some hang-ups that have happened in the past that have kept you from walking close to Jesus like you know that you wanted to do? Maybe your past is the reason that you serve in the ministry that you're serving in right now. Maybe you'd be like, man, if you only knew the things that happened in my life and the things that have happened in my past have formed me in such a way to where God has brought me to this point in my life where I can minister to this specific group of people because of the things that have happened in my past. My past has prepared me for my future. And so when we stop and when we think about that, listen, good or bad, our past shapes us and molds us into the person that we are right now. Our past takes us and changes us into the person that God can use. And what's so great about our pasts is that God takes our past experiences and our lessons learned, or maybe even some lessons not learned, and he takes all of that and he uses us for his name and for his fame and for his glory and his glory alone. He uses us to influence the people around us in the specific sphere that he gave us to make an impact on because of our past. If I've learned anything in the 36 years that I've had on this earth so far, it's that in every season of life, there's a lesson to be learned. Maybe it's a good season, there's still something to be learned. Maybe it's a bad season, there's definitely something to be learned. And when we do that, when we understand that growth can take place, which helps us to understand that Proverbs 3, 5 through 6 still rings true, that if we trust in the Lord with all of our hearts and lean not on our own understanding, then in all of our ways, if we'll acknowledge him, he will make our path straight. Listen, there's never been a person that believes that verse more than a senior that's getting ready to graduate from high school, because they're trying to figure it out. I don't know if I'm making the right choice. I don't know if I'm going in the right direction. I'm not sure if this thing that I have picked out for myself is correct. It might not be. We've got to lean on to him, because when we lean into the Lord, when we trust in him, when we allow him to lead and to shape and to mold our lives, then we come out of the other side of that season better for it, stronger for it. If we've leaned into the Lord and trusted him, then we come out, here's the amazing thing, closer to him than we were before we walked through it. Walking and talking more like him than we were before we walked and talked our way through it. Ready, prepared. So number one, we got to learn to serve before we try to lead. Number two, got to allow your past to prepare your future. And then number three, always stands on the things of the Lord. Always stand on the things of the Lord. If you will, let's look at verses 40 through 47 there in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It says, and he took his stick in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Then the Philistine came and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked down and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you have come at me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth. And all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into their hands. So as we look there at verses 40 through 47, I already know what some of you are going to say. You didn't finish the story, but I think you've probably heard it before. David throws a rock. It hits Goliath in the head. He falls to the ground, and David, like the man that he was, even though he was a teenager, ran over and grabbed Goliath's sword, cut his head off, and then held it off and showed his buddies all his trophy, right? And the armies of the Philistines went running, and that's how that battle kind of finished. But listen, there's so much. I love this part of the text of verses 40 through 47 because David says to Goliath, dude, you've talked enough. Like, you've already come out and done this for 40 days and 40 nights. I've heard enough. And it's my turn to talk now. And David essentially is telling Goliath that he's done, and it didn't matter to him how big he was, how tough he looked, how scary he might have seemed in that moment. David was not going to just stand idly by and allow Goliath to talk that way about his God. He was going to take a stand, and that's exactly what he did in this moment. For whatever reason, because it's just how my brain works, it's a scary place. This episode came to mind, and it's this episode called Skate Expectations. That's how you know it was the late 80s, early 90s. Skate Expectations. Has anybody ever seen this before, or am I just sharing all brand new information? Me and 3 people. You guys, hey, party in my office later, right now media, Skate Expectations, okay? I didn't ask that in the last service. It's probably better that I didn't, but it's good. So in this episode, Skate Expectations, Nicholas has this kid that's not really his friend yet, but they kind of like are around each other at school, and he notices that he's getting bullied, he's getting picked on. This literal bully from his school is just giving this friend like the hardest time. There's one scene where they're at lunch, and the bully literally comes and pulls a donut out of his bag, and he's like, oh, it's jelly filled, and crushes it on the kid's head. And Nicholas decides that he's had enough. He's like, man, I'm going to take a stand. So Nicholas, the artist, confronts the bully, who's a football player on the football team, and he's like, man, you got to leave this kid alone. And rather than fighting, because Nicholas knew he wasn't going to win in a fight, he challenges him to a skateboard race. So it's like, man, like high intense music, like it's crazy. And they do this skateboard race, and of course Nicholas wins, because what other option is there? And the bully has to leave his friend alone for all the rest of time, and thankfully Nicholas doesn't get beat up. But listen, I tell you all of that to tell you this. Nicholas took a stand for somebody that really wasn't his friend, and it would have been a whole lot easier for him to just stay silent. It would have been a whole lot easier for him to just keep his mouth shut. And I think that that's the tension point for us as Christians today in 2023, is it would be a whole lot easier to be silent. Like, let's be real. It'd be a whole lot easier to just keep our mouth shut and to just move on with our life and not have any confrontation or any problems or have to take a stand on anything. Like, it would be so much easier to stay silent when you're at work with your sexist and inappropriate boss that won't stop making jokes that you know that you don't want to be around. Like, it would be easier to stay silent when you're around your vulgar and derogatory family member that you're just like, gosh, man, I wish they would just stop. Here's one for the guys. It would be easier to stay silent when you're out with the boys and they're talking about their wives poorly and how they're not doing certain things and how they're not taking care of whatever. It'd be easier to stay silent. Here's one for the ladies. It'd be easier to stay silent when you're out with the girls and they start gossiping. I want you to think about how different David's life would look if he carried the cheese, if he took the bread and all the things to his brothers, and he went to the war and he sat down next to his brothers and he was like, man, it's like, this is how you guys are living right now? Like, this is tough. Like, this sleeping in tents with a bunch of dudes. You guys all stink. Like, man, I'd rather smell like sheep than this. This is terrible. And David's sitting there, and his brothers are enjoying their food. And as David's sitting there out of the corner of his eye, he sees this huge dude come walking out. And the guy starts talking smack on his God. And imagine if David was just like, man, like, is anybody going to do anything about that? Like, I just came to deliver food, and you guys, like, what? Who's gonna stop him? Imagine if David's just sitting there, and he's like, man, he is not nice. Like, his mom needs to wash his mouth out with soap. Do you hear the things that he's saying? I can't believe that he's talking. You guys are okay with him talking that way about our God? You guys are okay with him saying the things that he's saying? Imagine if David had just sat there and just said, guys, this isn't good. I mean, I'm not going to do anything about it. Like, I'm going to go back and hang out with my sheep because they smell better than you guys, and this dude's kind of scary, but, like, somebody should probably do something about this guy. Like, imagine if that was David. How different would his life have looked? And I can't help but wonder, what if we're doing the exact same thing and we're sitting silent and we're keeping our mouths shut when in all reality there's times where we're called to take a stand and speak the truth in love. This is what we see here, that we're to stand on the things of the Lord. That instead of staying silent, that we would speak up. Here's what Jesus says in Luke chapter 19 and verse 40. Jesus says this, if these become silent, the rocks will cry out. Jesus is speaking directly about his disciples in this moment. Imagine that for us, that if we were to be silent, then the rocks will cry out. If you know me, you know that I'm not a confrontational person. I do not like, nor do I look for confrontation. As a matter of fact, I do my best to avoid it at all costs. I do not like confrontation. But listen, I'm also not content with letting a rock cry out in my place if I'm too worried about standing up and being bold and taking a stand on the things of the Lord. I think it's time for the church as a whole to do what we see David here doing, and that's to take a stand on the things of the Lord. But I want to encourage you in this. Before you can take a stand on the things of the Lord, you have to know the things of the Lord.